I want to move on now to Willemien Kets. Willemien is an external professor here at the Santa Fe Institute and an associate professor in the Department of Economics at Oxford University. And in the interest of time, Willemien, let me just turn it over to you.
So let me jump right in. So this is joint work, based on joint work with a bunch of collaborators who deserve a lot of the credit. So one of the earliest ideas in economics about how stock market function comes from John Maynard Keynes, perhaps one of the best economists of all time. Keynes used an analogy based on a fictional newspaper contest in which entrants are asked to rank, to choose the 6 most attractive faces from 100 photographs. Now, Keynes' seminal insight was that you don't necessarily want to choose the faces that you think are the most handsome. Instead, he argued that it's not the case of choosing those faces that, to the best of your judgment, are really the prettiest, nor even those that the average opinion genuinely thinks the prettiest. Instead, you want to think about the faces that the majority entrants think is the most prettiest, and perhaps even those that you think that others think are the most prettiest, or even at higher levels. Now, Keynes believed that similar forces were at work at the stock market. So this would have people pricing shares not based on what they think what the fundamental value is, but rather on what they think that everyone else thinks the value is, or what everyone else would predict the average assessment to be, and so on. And this is obviously problematic for the long-term functioning of the economy. So the question is, how do we escape this trap? Now, the seminal insight, the big insight of Keynes is that trading in financial markets has an element of coordination. Now, within economics, coordination is studied as part of game theory, the study of strategic interactions. In its simplest form, the problem of coordination looks like this. So there's 2 players, and each player has 2 actions, action 1 and action 2. And one player chooses row, the other chooses column. Now the first entry in each cell is the payoff to player 1. The second entry is the payoff to player 2. So in this very simple example, there's 2 stable states that are also called Nash equilibria. One where both players choose action 1, and one in which they both choose action 2. Now, here's a simple variation of that game, which is probably a bit closer to what Keynes had in mind. So here, one of the Nash equilibria is better than the others. So we're both better off if we both choose action 1 than if we both choose action 2. But of course, choosing action 1 is riskier because if we miscoordinate, I get -4. Now, this simple setup is obviously way too simplistic to describe real financial markets. But by condensing the problem down to the essence, it does raise an important question. So how do people coordinate in real life, like in the setting that Keynes had in mind? Now, traditional game theory and traditional economics assumes away this problem. So it simply predicts that people coordinate on one of those Nash equilibria. But of course, this just shifts the level of analysis, because what equilibrium do people coordinate on? And this is actually important, because if coordination is easy, well, then we should be really concerned, according to Keynes. Because if coordinating pressures are strong, we might just end up coordinating on the wrong equilibrium, like in a right matrix where we both end up getting 1 rather than getting 5. So in Keynes, so in financial markets, it could be that everyone chooses investments that have a low fundamental value just because they think that everyone else is doing so. But if coordination is hard, we're not out of the woods yet. If people miscoordinate, so if they choose different actions, they may end up getting a low payoff. For example, I get -4 if I choose action 1 and you choose the other action. And in Keynes' setup, that would be choosing investments that have a good fundamental value, but other people choosing a different investment. So, and I may lose out. Now, Tom Schelling, a Nobel Prize winner and a frequent visitor to SFI before he died, already noted that the answer to the question of how people coordinate lies outside of economics. So he noted that in coordination games, a player's objective is to make contact with the other player through some imaginative process of introspection. Now, in the 1960s, when Tom Schelling wrote this, psychology was not advanced enough to shed light on this. But now we know that people can use theory of mind to reach such a meaning of the mind. Now, theory of mind is a central concept in psychology. It refers to the cognitive ability to take another person's perspective. It consists of two stages, which is very much akin to Kahneman and Tversky's distinction between system 1 and system 2. So the first stage is a fast and instinctive process, and it involves introspection. People use their own mental state to form an initial belief about others. So like I said, this is a fast and instinctive process, and it's followed by a slower, more deliberative process. In the second stage, people rely on a naive understanding of psychology to reason about other people. And this may lead them to adjust their beliefs. Now, this is obviously a very complex process that psychologists have a lot to say about. But in order to bring it into economic models, I'm going to simplify it tremendously. So I'm going to assume that each player has an impulse to take a certain action. So in Keynes' example, your impulse could be, for instance, to choose the prettiest face. Now, this defines what I call the level 0 strategy. So people just follow their impulse. But of course, it may not be optimal to act on impulse. So Keynes also observed that it's in the newspaper context, you don't want to choose the face that you think is prettiest. So you introspect. You think about other people's impulses, what impulses they might have, using your own impulse as a guide. So this defines the so-called level 1 strategy. So you adjust your response, because if you after introspect, you might, this introspection might lead you to adjust your response. So after introspection, you might find that acting on impulse is not actually optimal. And that choosing another action gives you a higher payoff. So this gives you the level 1 strategy. Now, of course, the reasoning process need not stop here. So in general, the level K strategy is a strategy that gives you the highest payoff against other people's level K-1 strategy. Now, this process continues until nobody wants to adjust their response. And that means that we have reached an equilibrium. So this equilibrium is the limit of an introspective process where the number of levels that people reason through goes to infinity. Now, of course, nobody actually reasons up to infinity, not even hyper-rational economists. But everything that I'm going to say today is going to hold true also if people stop at some finite level. The only reason I put infinity there is that I want to emphasize that any action we get is not going to be driven by something like bounded rationality. Instead, it's going to come from theory of mind. Okay, so what drives people's impulses? Now, traditional economics starts from the premise of methodological individualism. So in other words, Homo economicus lives in a vacuum. But of course, the key insight from the other social sciences is that much of human behavior is influenced by the culture that we live in and the narratives that we're exposed to. So, for example, the psychologist Paul DiMaggio and the psychologist Hazel Marcus write that people think and feel and act in ways that are shaped by particular patterns of historically derived meanings, practices, products, and institutions. Now, psychology, sociology, and anthropology obviously have very rich insights to offer on this. But as a reductionist economist, I'm going to again boil it down to a single number. So Q is the probability that another person has the same impulse. It's a measure of the extent to which people use the same cultural mental models. So this produces a simple dichotomy. So if Q is large, so close to 1, then we have a strong homogeneous culture, because I'm almost certain that you have the same impulse as I do. Whereas if Q is small, we have a weak culture. Perhaps we live in a culturally diverse society. So my own impulse is not very informative of what your impulse might be. So back to the problem of coordination. So how does this dichotomy play out here? Now here we have the very simple game again. And the theory shows that in this game, in this very simple setting, people act on impulse. So why is that? Well, suppose that I have an impulse to choose action 2, perhaps because it's salient to me. Now, if you and I grew up in the same culture and were exposed to the same social and cultural patterns, we're likely to have the same mental models. So it's likely, more likely than not, that you have the same impulse as I do. So in the language of the model, Q is greater than 1/2. But that means that it's optimal for me to act on impulse. Because if I choose action 2, it's more likely than not that your impulse is to choose action 2. So it gives, choosing action 2 gives me a payoff of greater than 1/2. Whereas if I switch to action 1, I expect a payoff that's less than 1/2, because I think it's unlikely that you have an impulse to choose action 1. Now, the same is true, of course, for you. So most of the time we end up coordinating on one of the actions. Now, the important implication is that in this case, it's better to have a strong impulse. Why is that? Well, the more mental models we share, the higher Q, and that means that there's a higher probability that we actually coordinate. So there's a higher probability that we end up on the diagonal where we get a positive payoff rather than off diagonal where we get nothing. So in this case, strategic uncertainty, so uncertainty about what other people might do, is actually bad. So having a shared culture can be beneficial, but can it also hurt? Now for that, we need to go back to a game that is close to what Keynes had in mind, where some outcomes are better than others. Now first, suppose that there's a very strong culture. So I'm very, very certain that you have the same impulse as I do. So again, suppose that I have an impulse to choose action 2. And because we have, we grew up in the same culture, I'm almost certain you have the same impulse. So that means that if I choose action 2, I expect a payoff that's close to 1. Whereas if I choose action 1, I expect a payoff that's close to -1. So of course I'm going to go with action 1, and so do you, and we end up getting 1 rather than 5. So the problem with a strong culture in this case is that because there's no strategic uncertainty, social expectations trump payoffs. So that this becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think you're going to choose action 2. So I'm going to choose action 2, and so do you, and we end up in a bad outcome. So what happens if we don't have a strong culture? So the culture is weaker, perhaps the society is more diverse. Now in that case, there's more uncertainty about what other people might do. So in the language of the model, my Q is close to 1/2. So I have an impulse to choose action 2, but in that case, the payoff I expect to get from choosing action 2 is only close to 1/2. So 1/2 times 0, 1/2 times 1. So what if I choose action 1? Well, in that case, the payoff I expect to get is actually 4. 1/2 times 5 minus 1/2 times 1. So that's 4 is better than 1/2. So so we end up, you go through the same reasoning, we both end up choosing action 1, even if we have an impulse to choose the other action. So because there is strategic uncertainty, because I don't know what your impulse is going to be, payoffs can trump expectations. In a way, there's less pressure to conform. And that means that in this case, uncertainty is beneficial. We're better off because we coordinate on a good outcome rather than getting locked into a bad outcome. So the key insight is that in this setting, culture both enables and constrains, which is actually a classic insight from sociology. And in this economic model, it occurs because there's really two types of coordination problems rather than one. So one is to minimize the risk of miscoordination. So we want to choose the same action. We don't want to end up choosing different actions. But the second problem is that we want to avoid inefficient lock-in. We want to coordinate on the right outcome, not on a bad outcome. So in the context of Keynes' example, we want to choose the investment with a good fundamental investment, even of course, we also want to choose investments that are popular. And the insight is that the trade-off is resolved very differently in different economic settings. So in this example, no action stands out in terms of payoffs because it's equally good to coordinate on action one as it is to coordinate on action two. So in this case, the priority is to minimize miscoordination. And that means that a strong homogeneous culture is beneficial because it means that there's less strategic uncertainty and therefore less miscoordination. But in other games, some action may stand out in terms of payoff. So here, action one, coordinating on action one is definitely better than coordinating on action two. And then the priority is to avoid inefficient lock-in. We don't want to get locked into an outcome where we both choose action two just because we think that other people choose that action. And in that case, a weak culture is beneficial because a weak culture means that there's more strategic uncertainty, there's lots of behavioral variation, and that means that there's less pressure to conform. So this is a very simple dichotomy, yet it yields universal insights. So my collaborators and I have applied these ideas to a range of settings, more than I can list here. And the theory explains why culturally diverse societies are less conformist, but at the same time, they may get stuck in a low trust trap. So they don't, people in a diverse society feel less pressure to conform. At the same time, the miscoordination that can occur can lead to less trust. The theory can also shows why companies with a strong culture may fail to adopt superior work practices when the economic environment changes. But at the same time, companies with a strong culture outperform companies with a weak culture when the environment is more stable. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, we can go well beyond economic settings. Because remember, the idea is really that behavior is driven by theory of mind. So what people think about what other people think. So we wanted to know how people on the autism spectrum behave compared to more neurotypical people, because autism is characterized by an impairment in perspective taking abilities, so problems with theory of mind. And what we found is exactly what the theory predicted. So individuals with autism outperform neurotypical people in games where it's important to avoid inefficient lock-in, because autism means that it's harder for them to take other people's perspective, and that's a good thing if you want to avoid inefficient lock-in. At the same time, neurotypical people outperform people with autism in games where no action stands out in terms of payoffs, because there it's really important to avoid miscoordination. Okay, on that note, I'm going to end, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Willemien. Again, as I mentioned before, for Doan, applause does not really work over Zoom, but I will applause and thank you greatly for that talk. I will ask as we move into Q&A, maybe if you could turn your camera on, that might be
Yeah.
an easier way for folks to interact. Again, as we did before, I'm going to encourage people to put questions into the chat, but also to use the raise hand function. I'd actually like to start off that process, if I could, and sort of ask about, where you see different sweet spots, right? So it seems like there's this dichotomy where there are some sorts of, problems for which that reward a strong culture, or a high Q. There are other sorts of problems that reward sort of that cognitive or cultural diversity, or a lower Q. Do you have any sense for the sorts of problems that firms typically encounter? How you might think about locating that sweet spot, because I suspect it is not all to one side or the other.
No, that's a great question, and actually that's the question that I'm working on right now. So no, this is a really important question. So in economics, typically, so the kind of the traditional approach is to think about how do you design incentives, and what this research agenda points to is that you shouldn't design incentives in isolation. You should design the incentives together with the culture. So you choose not simply the incentives separate from how do you what kind of corporate culture do you want to have, but instead you choose them together. And so what we found is that, well, obviously having a highly cooperative and collaborative culture is a good thing. And if that's the case, and then you want to, so if your culture is already optimal for the kind of economic environment that you're in, well, that's great. Then you want to have a strong culture. But of course, there can be a misfit between your current culture and the environment that you're in, and because culture is just difficult to change. Now, obviously, in the long run, you want to change your culture, but to the extent that that's not possible, you have to work with what you have. And there, actually, you want to de-emphasize the culture in a way. So rather than having a strong culture and reinforcing it constantly with kind of like all team meetings and all hands meetings and team building activities, you want to kind of de-emphasize the culture so that people can rely more on their broader environment, and also there's more uncertainty about what is expected, so people can kind of like feel their way towards the optimum themselves without being constrained by the culture that they're in.
And so just to sort of make sure I'm understanding that and maybe tie it back to some of the conversation that we had yesterday, are you saying that if we want to have an organization that does a better job of not falling prey to some of these, belief narratives that are maybe deceptive, actually weakening the corporate culture to some extent might create an organization that's better able to avoid falling victim to some of those false narratives?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much, Willemien. This is, I think, extremely relevant to the conversation that we're having today, and a great presentation.